Have you ever experienced a moment when everything seemed perfect until suddenly your life turned upside down? Have you ever felt the pain of betrayal from the one you trusted most, precisely on the day that should have been one of the happiest of your life? If you've been through this, you know how devastating it is, and if you haven't, trust me, this story will captivate you from beginning to end. My name is Mary Johnson, I'm 65 years old, and I never imagined my life would change so painfully. Precisely on the day I celebrated another year of marriage. I've always been that dedicated, faithful, God-fearing woman. I was active in church, helped with ministries, counseled couples, and believed my home was a reflection of Christ's love and grace. For decades, I lived believing I had a solid marriage, a strong family, and a peaceful future with the man I chose to love. On that special morning, I woke with my heart full of gratitude. I had prepared a simple surprise, but one, made with great love, wanting to celebrate our history and honor all we had built together. For me, it was a day of silent vow renewal, a moment to thank God for another year of blessings in marriage. But, unbeknownst to me, that would be the day all my certainties would be shattered. As I struggled to make that day unforgettable, I realized something was off. His gaze was distant, his answers cold, his gestures mechanical. And you know how your heart feels something before you even see it? Something told me I was about to discover a truth that would change everything forever. It was there, amid forced smiles and empty words, that a simple notification on his phone opened the door to a world I never wanted to know. Warning: this revelation will leave you speechless. From that moment on, my life was no longer the same. I had no idea I was about to face the greatest shock of my life, a pain no woman should ever feel. I've always been that woman who believed she'd done everything right. From a young age, I grew up hearing about the importance of family, faith, and obedience to God. I married at 25, full of dreams, and over the years, I dedicated my life to being the best wife and mother I could be. I woke up early to take care of the house, prepared meals with love, and paid attention to every detail so my husband would feel loved and respected. At church, I was known as someone who always helped, who was ready to counsel other women, and who firmly advocated the importance of maintaining a strong marriage, even in the face of difficulties. I believed with all my heart that love was a daily decision, that faith in God was the foundation of everything, and that if I did my part, He would honor my marriage. Those were years of complicity, of prayer together, of shared projects. We laughed, dreamed, made plans for the future. I looked at him and thought that, despite all the imperfections, we were on the right path. I never suspected a thing. For me, our relationship was stable, almost unshakable. But you know that feeling of security that seems eternal? It can be as fragile as glass. And the hardest part is realizing that, behind appearances, there's a hidden truth you never imagined facing. Over time, I realized I was living more for the image of the perfect family than for reality. It's hard to admit it now, but I was a woman who forgot herself to keep everything going. I sacrificed myself, believing this was the right way to love. The truth is, when we put all our energy into someone, ignoring the signs and forgetting who we are, we leave room for small fissures to silently grow. And that's exactly what happened to me. While I thought I was holding on, he was already distant, elsewhere, with someone else. This shock made me understand how seemingly small decisions, like ignoring a withdrawal or not talking about what's bothering us, can have a huge impact on the future. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because what happened next was what really turned my life upside down and forced me to see not only the betrayal, but also the behind the scenes of a marriage that I thought I knew inside and out. We had been together for 38 years, and I used to say he was my safe haven. He was the one I trusted with my greatest joys and my deepest fears. He wasn't just my husband. He was my friend, my prayer partner, the one with whom I shared every stage of life. I always believed we had a special connection, built on faith and a commitment to stand by each other through thick and thin. I saw him as a man of integrity, someone who held firm principles and who would never let me down. To me, we were an exemplary couple within the church, a model of perseverance and unity. People looked at us and praised our story. We had that image of a blessed family, 3 children raised with Christian values, a home full of happy moments, simple but memorable trips. And it was in this routine of affection and complicity that I believed I was safe. With him, I felt protected, respected, and even proud to have a husband who seemed so committed to faith and family. When I talked about him, my eyes would shine because I truly believed I had made the right choice in my youth and that this love would last forever. But life has an unexpected way of revealing hidden truths. While I saw him as my companion on this journey, someone I could trust blindly, he was already distant, creating a parallel world where I had no place. This is what hurts most when I think about the betrayal. It wasn't just the breaking of a vow, but the discovery that, for a long time, I had been living in a reality that didn't exist for either of us. It's strange to realize how small actions, those that once seemed harmless, take on new meaning when the truth comes to light. A prolonged silence, a subtle change in behavior, an emotional absence disguised as fatigue. It was all there, but I chose not to see it. Blind trust, which seemed like a virtue, actually left me vulnerable. I never questioned, never doubted, and deep down, this attitude prevented me from facing reality before it was too late. Looking back, I understand that living on autopilot, believing that only time can strengthen a relationship, is a dangerous illusion. Love requires presence, dialogue, and above all, conscious choices. When we let routine take over and ignore signs of distance, we make room for something silent, almost imperceptible, to grow and destroy what seemed unshakable. This realization only came to me when the truth was brutally revealed, on the day I least expected it. And it was right there, in that moment, that everything began to change in ways I could never have imagined. Thinking about all this still brings me a mixture of pain and learning. I spent almost 4 decades believing that nothing could shake the history we built together. And perhaps that's why I share every detail here. Because I know that many women have experienced, or are still experiencing, situations in which they trust blindly and end up being cruelly surprised. If, in some way, my experience can open someone's eyes or bring comfort to a wounded heart, then it's worth exposing such an intimate part of my life. That's why I kindly ask you to like this video. It may seem like a small gesture, but your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with real, transformative stories like this one. When you like it, you help this message reach other women who need to hear that they're not alone, that there's hope even after pain. This means a lot to me because it shows that this conversation is resonating with you and so many others who carry similar scars. And as I recall everything I experienced, I realize how strange it is to think that, at that moment, I had no idea I was about to face the biggest turning point of my life. Every gesture he made that day, every carefully spoken word, hid a secret that would completely change the way I viewed love, trust, and even myself. That day, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun seemed to shine differently, and my heart felt light, full of gratitude. I remember lying there for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything we'd experienced together. The struggles, the triumphs, the difficulties we'd overcome side by side. It was our wedding anniversary, and I wanted to make that day something special, even if simple. No grand gestures were needed, because for me, what mattered was celebrating our story and thanking God for sustaining us through so many years. I spent the morning planning every detail. I prepared his favorite meal, bought flowers, and wrote a loving note reminiscing about the memorable moments we'd shared. For me, it was more than a celebration. It was a way to silently renew my vows, reaffirming how grateful I was for this journey. I was proud of our marriage. I believed our union was solid, and this celebration was, deep down, an attempt to show him how much I valued everything we'd built. As I set the table and tidied the house, my mind was filled with memories. I mentally relived our youth, the early years of marriage, the birth of our children, every step that shaped us as a family. This was my outlook on life, believing that daily dedication, no matter how small, kept the flame of love alive. And that day, I was convinced he would see it, that he would sense how happy and proud I was that we had made it this far. However, there was something in his manner that bothered me, even though I tried to ignore it. He seemed distant, distracted, as if he were only physically present. I noticed a blank stare at times, an awkward silence amidst otherwise trivial conversations. It made me wonder, for a moment, if something was wrong, but I quickly dismissed the thought, telling myself it was just fatigue. After all, routine and everyday problems often take their toll. It's curious how our hearts perceive signs before our minds accept reality. I sensed something was different, but I chose to cling to the idea that nothing could shake that day. I wanted to believe we were okay, that the man standing before me was still the same man who, years ago, held my hand at the altar and promised to love me until the end. Everything seemed normal until a small distraction completely changed the course of that evening. A discreet sound, a notification on his phone, strangely caught my attention. It was there, amidst the flowers, the food, and an atmosphere that should have been celebratory, that something inside me began to scream, warning me that a painful revelation was about to happen. That notification seemed to echo throughout the room. It was a quick, almost imperceptible sound, but it made my heart race in a strange way. He hurriedly grabbed his phone, turned the screen face down, and tried to act as if nothing had happened. But in that instant, something inside me awakened. It was as if my entire body sensed a hidden truth about to be revealed. The coldness in his gaze, the restrained way he spoke to me that day, everything suddenly made sense. I'd already noticed over the past few weeks small, subtle changes. He was less present, too distracted, always having some excuse for coming home late or avoiding deeper conversations. But, like so many other women, I chose to believe it was just a difficult phase, perhaps overwork or accumulated fatigue. I didn't want to create problems where I thought they didn't exist, but that night, faced with that gesture, there was no longer any way to ignore it. His gaze was different, cold, distant. It was as if we were at the same table, but in completely separate worlds. No matter how much I tried to make conversation, he responded with short, mechanical sentences, as if he were simply fulfilling an obligation. This hurt me more than I wanted to admit, because it made me feel invisible, as if my presence no longer mattered to him. Deep down, my heart already knew. There are things the mind tries to deny, but the soul immediately recognizes. This feeling of estrangement, of disconnection, is a silent sign that something has changed. And I felt it intensely, like a painful reminder that our story was no longer the same. Even so, I tried to keep smiling, serving the food, pretending everything was fine. It's amazing how we get used to masking our emotions to avoid facing reality. I wanted to believe he was still there with me, that it was all just an impression, but his every gesture told me otherwise. That sparkle in his eyes, which had so often made me feel loved, was gone. In its place, there was a void hard to explain, a silent abyss growing between us. And then, as I tried to act natural, something unexpected happened, something so simple, yet so profound that it made me realize that the truth I had feared so much was about to come to light. It all happened so quickly, as if time had stopped for a few seconds. He got up to get something from the kitchen and left his phone on the table, face down. Maybe it was an oversight. Maybe he was overconfident that I would never touch that device. But in that instant, something inside me urged me to turn the screen. There was no password at that moment, just the notification still open. It was a short message, but charged with an intimacy that made me feel like my world had been ripped from under me. The words were simple yet cutting, impossible to misinterpret. I read and reread them, trying to find another explanation, but there was none. The message revealed a deep emotional bond with another woman, someone who spoke to him in a way I hadn't heard in a long time. My body froze. My hands began to tremble. I felt a weight on my chest so intense it felt impossible to breathe. It was as if all the certainties of nearly 4 decades had shattered before my eyes. When he returned to the room, I looked at him and for a moment wanted to believe it was all a mistake, that I had misread it. But I knew that look. There was guilt there. There was fear. I asked, my voice breaking, and he took a few seconds that felt like an eternity before confirming what I feared most. He didn't try to deny it, didn't make excuses. He said, almost without emotion, that there was someone, a woman he had been seeing for some time. The pain I felt in that moment is impossible to fully describe. It wasn't just the betrayal, but the way it was revealed on a day that should have been a day of celebration. It was as if all the love, trust, plans, and memories had been tarnished at once. I felt like I had lost not only a husband, but also the version of my life I believed to be real. The tears came before I could even say anything. It was a mixture of anger, sadness, and disbelief. Everything felt surreal, as if I were outside my own body, witnessing a scene that couldn't possibly be mine. And in that instant, I realized that this discovery wasn't just about him and another woman. It was also about me and everything I'd ignored for years to maintain a semblance of happiness. He tried to justify himself, but the words sounded distant, empty, unable to erase the revelation that had just shattered the life I knew. All I could think about was how so many silent decisions over time had led us to this, and how the truth, painful as it was now completely exposed. It was as if the ground had dropped out from under my feet. My heart was beating so fast it felt like it was about to burst out of my chest, while my hands trembled uncontrollably. Tears flowed uncontrollably, and everything around me seemed distant, as if the world had gone silent. It was hard to believe this was happening to me, who had always championed fidelity, the importance of trust, and the strength of a marriage founded on God. I looked at him and saw a stranger. It was as if this man, with whom I'd shared 38 years of my life, was suddenly just someone I no longer knew. His voice, his words, everything rang hollow. There was no genuine regret, only cold justifications, as if it were inevitable. It was impossible not to feel anger, pain, and a sense of profound humiliation. I wondered how he could look into my eyes so many times, call me wife, hold me close, and still betray everything we had. In that moment, thousands of memories flashed through my mind. Our wedding day, the vows we made, the nights we prayed together for strength to overcome hardships. And suddenly I realized that this whole story I thought was solid had long had cracks, but I chose to ignore them. This realization was like a second stab, understanding that, somehow, I too had allowed the relationship to reach this point, not by cheating, but by turning a blind eye to the signs that had always been there. I felt a mixture of despair and helplessness. It was as if, along with the discovery of the betrayal, came the death of a version of myself. The woman I believed had a secure marriage, who trusted blindly, simply ceased to exist in that moment. It was the beginning of a forced transformation, a painful journey I would never have chosen, but which was being forced upon me. As he spoke, everything seemed so distant. I could barely hear the words, only see his lips moving. I felt like I was floating, as if my body were present, but my mind was trying to escape that unbearable reality. And at the same time, a whirlwind of thoughts arose. What did I do wrong? How will I tell my children? What will become of me after this? The worst part was realizing that, even after admitting the betrayal, he didn't show the pain I expected to see. I wanted sincere repentance, a heartfelt apology, but what I saw was just someone trying to justify themselves, as if his decision were natural, almost inevitable. This devastated me even more, because it made me feel like all the love I'd given him over the decades simply wasn't worth it anymore. I remember getting up and going to my room, closing the door behind me. I sat on the edge of my bed and cried like I hadn't cried since I was a child, a cry that seemed to come from my soul. It was a pain that had no explanation, an open wound that no one could understand except those who had been through it. I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was there, cruel, without room for doubt. It felt like my life had been split into two parts, before and after that night. Everything I knew, everything I believed in, had changed forever. From that moment on, I knew nothing would ever be the same, and it was there, in the silence of that room, with my eyes swollen from crying, that I realized I was faced with an inevitable choice. Either I would let myself be destroyed by that betrayal, or I would find the strength to rebuild myself, even without knowing where to begin. But before any decision, I still had to face the most painful hours of my life, because the impact of that discovery would not end there. He finally confessed. Looking into my eyes, with a coldness I'd never seen before, he said the words that tore my soul apart. He was in love with another woman. It wasn't just a fling, something fleeting. He spoke as if he'd found new meaning in life, as if I were just an old part of a story he wanted to leave behind. And the worst part, it was someone I knew, a woman from my own church, someone I'd prayed with, shared confidences with, believing I had a sister in faith by my side. The humiliation was unbearable. I felt betrayed not only as a wife, but also as a woman, a friend, and a servant of God. This wasn't just a breach of trust in the marriage, it was the destruction of everything I believed about loyalty, respect, and Christian values. He claimed to love someone else, while I was still trying to understand how, in so many church meetings, services, and prayer times, they could look at me and act as if nothing was happening. At that moment, all the pieces began to fall into place in my mind. I remembered small gestures, quick glances, seemingly innocent conversations. It was as if the truth had always been there, hidden behind a facade of holiness and good intentions. This was perhaps the most painful part of the entire process, realizing that the betrayal hadn't happened suddenly, but had been building slowly behind the scenes, while I continued to believe I had a faithful man by my side, committed to God. The feeling of helplessness was devastating. I wondered how I would be able to face not only the loss of my marriage, but also the silent judgment of an entire community that sooner or later would discover the truth. Shame consumed me, because I knew that for many, it would be easier to blame me than to try to understand the depth of my pain. This is a harsh reality that many women face. Even after being betrayed, they end up being seen as responsible for the failure of the relationship. As he talked about his feelings for her, he seemed completely disconnected from the destruction he was causing. There was no true regret, just a decision made, a choice that had already been made long before that conversation. It made me understand, brutally, how small concessions in life, moments when we fail to prioritize dialogue, presence, truth, can lead to irreversible consequences. I wanted to scream, cry, ask what that woman had that I didn't, but I remained silent, swallowing a lump in my throat. I realized that nothing I said would change the truth. He had already made his choice, and it wasn't me anymore. This realization brought a pain so intense, it felt physical, as if something had ripped out a piece of me that I would never get back. I sat there, motionless, listening to his words echo in my mind. It was impossible not to feel anger, disgust, sadness, and a profound sense of injustice. How could someone who promised to love me before God reach this point? How could a woman I considered a friend accept this? These questions kept hammering away at me, but there was no answer that could lessen the pain. It was at that moment that I bitterly realized that that night wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of a new journey, a phase in which I would have to make difficult decisions, rebuild my identity, and above all, face truths I'd never wanted to face. And even without knowing how, I understood that the transformation that would come afterward was inevitable. He finally confessed. Looking into my eyes, with a coldness I'd never seen before, he said the words that tore my soul apart. He was in love with another woman. It wasn't just a fling, something fleeting. He spoke as if he'd found new meaning in life, as if I were just an old part of a story he wanted to leave behind. And the worst part? It was someone I knew, a woman from my own church, someone I'd prayed with, shared confidences with, believing I had a sister in faith by my side. The humiliation was unbearable. I felt betrayed not only as a wife, but also as a woman, a friend, and a servant of God. This wasn't just a breach of trust in the marriage. It was the destruction of everything I believed about loyalty, respect, and Christian values. He claimed to love someone else, while I was still trying to understand how, in so many church meetings, services, and prayer times, they could look at me and act as if nothing was happening. At that moment, all the pieces began to fall into place in my mind. I remembered small gestures, quick glances, seemingly innocent conversations. It was as if the truth had always been there, hidden behind a facade of holiness and good intentions. This was perhaps the most painful part of the entire process, realizing that the betrayal hadn't happened suddenly, but had been building slowly, behind the scenes, while I continued to believe I had a faithful man by my side, committed to God. The feeling of helplessness was devastating. I wondered how I would be able to face not only the loss of my marriage, but also the silent judgment of an entire community that sooner or later would discover the truth. Shame consumed me, because I knew that for many it would be easier to blame me than to try to understand the depth of my pain. This is a harsh reality that many women face. Even after being betrayed, they end up being seen as responsible for the failure of the relationship. As he talked about his feelings for her, he seemed completely disconnected from the destruction he was causing. There was no true regret, just a decision made, a choice that had already been made long before that conversation. It made me understand, brutally, how small concessions in life, moments when we fail to prioritize dialogue, presence, truth, can lead to irreversible consequences. I wanted to scream, cry, ask what that woman had that I didn't, but I remained silent, swallowing a lump in my throat. I realized that nothing I said would change the truth. He had already made his choice, and it wasn't me anymore. This realization brought a pain so intense, it felt physical, as if something had ripped out a piece of me that I would never get back. I sat there motionless, listening to his words echo in my mind. It was impossible not to feel anger, disgust, sadness, and a profound sense of injustice. How could someone who promised to love me before God reach this point? How could a woman I considered a friend accept this? These questions kept hammering away at me, but there was no answer that could lessen the pain. It was at that moment that I bitterly realized that that night wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of a new journey, a phase in which I would have to make difficult decisions, rebuild my identity, and above all, face truths I'd never wanted to face. And even without knowing how, I understood that the transformation that would come afterward was inevitable. In the days following that night, I was still in shock, trying to cope with the pain, the betrayal, and the feeling of emptiness that had settled inside me. But nothing prepared me for what was to come. The reaction of the church and the Christian community that for so many years I considered my second family. I always believed that in that place I would find welcome, prayer, and support. After all, we had spent decades serving side by side, participating in ministries, counseling other couples, and being seen as examples of faith and perseverance. When I finally found the courage to open my heart to some close people, hoping to find comfort, I was met with judgmental looks. I heard phrases that still echo in my mind, like, "Were you a good wife to him? Perhaps you lacked the wisdom to manage your marriage?" Or, even worse, "A wise woman builds a house. Perhaps you failed to fulfill your role." Each of these words was like a new wound being opened in an already deeply wounded soul. I realized that many were more concerned with keeping up appearances than dealing with the truth. Some said I should pray more and fight for my marriage, as if everything depended solely on me, as if I had any control over his choices. Few were willing to truly listen to me, to try to understand the depth of the pain I was experiencing. It was as if his betrayal were a minor detail, and the bigger issue was what I had failed to do as a Christian wife. This stance made me see a cruel and silent side within. Many communities, the burden placed on women to sustain the relationship at any cost, even when they are the victim. I realized how, so often, the backstage of faith is filled with unrealistic expectations, which trap women in abusive or destructive relationships, all in the name of supposedly correct submission. I felt alone, misunderstood, as if my story were just another topic of conversation in the church hallways. It was painful to realize that some people chose to distance themselves from me while remaining friends with him, and surprisingly, even with the woman he had cheated on me with. This exposed a harsh truth. Those who preach love and compassion aren't always able to demonstrate them in practice. But amidst so much judgment, I also encountered a few sincere hearts, people who truly reached out, prayed with me, and helped me not completely lose faith. These gestures showed me that, even in the darkest moments, God always puts the right people in our path to remind us that we are not alone. Still, that experience made me rethink a lot about the structure of relationships within the church and how we urgently need to talk more about empathy, truth, and emotional accountability. Every sidelong glance, every comment disguised as spiritual advice, made me question who I was and whether I had truly failed as a wife. It was a period of great inner turmoil, during which I needed to revisit my own mindset and begin to see that his fault wasn't mine, that the decision to cheat was entirely his, and that I shouldn't carry the burden of a mistake I didn't make. But before I reached that understanding, I would still have to face even more painful situations, because the betrayal didn't just destroy my marriage. It exposed the fragility of relationships I believed were solid, revealing an uncomfortable truth about the people around me and how judgment can be cruel, disguised as godly advice. Amidst so much disappointment and judgment, I began to understand that telling my story could be more than just a vent. It was, in some ways, an act of courage, a step toward my own healing, and also a way to reach other women who might be experiencing something similar but lacked the voice, support, or courage to speak out. I realized that when we share real experiences, we help break the silence and guilt that so often imprison us. That's why I want to continue sharing everything I've learned on this journey, not just the pain, but also the lessons, the difficult decisions, and the small victories that helped me rebuild who I am. If this topic resonates with you, if you somehow identified with what I experienced, subscribe to the channel. Your participation is what makes this space grow and reach more people with this kind of content that transforms, welcomes, and gives hope to those who need to hear that they are not alone on this journey. Each registration means this message will reach more women who need support, clarity, and strength to start over. Together, we can create a community where real stories are valued and where no one needs to feel ashamed of having gone through difficult times. I want this to be a place of exchange, empathy, and truth, because I know how much that's missing when we're broken inside. And while I was going through all of this internally, realizing how my life was being turned upside down, I had no idea that I would still face even more challenging situations, which would test my faith, my identity, and my ability to get back up again. Soon after everything came to light, I realized there was no room for my pain to be expressed. The few times I tried to talk about what I felt, the responses were always the same. You need to forgive and forget. Be submissive. God will honor your fidelity. Pray more. Fight for your marriage. It was as if my sadness and indignation were signs of spiritual weakness, as if feeling anger or hurt were a sin. And instead of finding empathy, I found accusations. I felt suffocated, as if my voice had been ripped from me. That advice, which seemed so pious on the surface, only served to further trap me in an emotional prison. They told me I needed to carry that cross in silence, as a test of faith, but inside I was shattered. It was as if my pain wasn't legitimate, as if being a woman forced me to endure everything in silence. With each passing day, I felt more invisible. I began to realize that for many, maintaining the appearance of a united Christian family was more important than the truth. This made me see the hypocrisy behind many beautiful speeches. Talking about forgiveness is easy when you haven't walked in the shoes of someone who has been betrayed, humiliated, and abandoned. I was experiencing a gigantic internal conflict. I still wanted to honor God, but I could no longer accept that reality as normal or acceptable. It was during this period that I began to reflect on how so many women live, trapped in standards and expectations that prevent them from recognizing their own worth. The hidden truth is that, in many communities, the weight of guilt always falls on us, and silence becomes the norm. But the more I tried to remain silent, the more my heart screamed inside. I knew that if I continued like this, I would lose who I was. This realization was painful, but it also brought an unexpected kind of clarity. I needed to decide whether I would continue living as a spectator of my own life or whether I would have the courage to rewrite my story. That's when the seed of transformation began to sprout within me. Even though I didn't know exactly how I would take the next steps, I began to question everything I believed to be my duty as a Christian wife. I came to understand that submission wasn't synonymous with self-denial, and that true forgiveness couldn't be imposed, but rather the fruit of a process of inner healing. It was a shock to realize how, for years, I had put myself on the back burner, to uphold an image that ultimately had nothing real about it. Even so, it was still hard to imagine how I would proceed from there. The voices telling me to hang in there still echoed in my mind, making me wonder if I was being selfish for thinking about myself. But deep down, something was already shifting inside me, something that would lead me to decisions I never thought I'd have the courage to make. That night remained etched in my mind like an open wound that took a long time to heal. I was alone in my room, kneeling at the foot of the bed, my face swollen from crying. The words that came out of my mouth were almost a desperate whisper. Why me, Lord? Why now, after everything I've lived through and dedicated to this family? I couldn't find answers, only a feeling of profound emptiness, as if the entire meaning of my life had been ripped away in a single day. Memories of our years together played through my mind like a cruel film, showing every detail of moments I believed to be true. The betrayal wasn't just a breach of trust. It was as if my entire history had been rewritten without my consent, revealing a hidden truth that had always been there, but which I never wanted to see. This revelation left me devastated, making me question not only my marriage, but also who I was, what my true values were, and even my faith. With each tear that fell, I wondered if I'd done something wrong, if things could have been different. This kind of thinking is destructive, but it's inevitable when we're hurt. The mindset of blame and self-punishment was strong, as if I were responsible for all that chaos. And deep down, the most painful thing was feeling that, even in that moment of such vulnerability, I still needed to be strong for others, because so many people expected me to act with dignity, patience, and submission. As I wept, I realized I was at a turning point. It was as if God was showing me that I had two choices: remain in that place of emotional destruction, living as a victim of someone else's decisions, or begin, albeit with small and uncertain steps, to rebuild my story. But this was not an easy decision, because in addition to the pain, there was the fear of judgment, of complete abandonment, of the loneliness that seemed inevitable. It was one of the longest nights of my life. I didn't sleep a wink, just felt my heart pound with pain. I remember holding the Bible in my hands, seeking solace in the words that had so often brought me peace. But that early morning, even reading seemed too much. I felt like nothing would ever make sense again, that my identity had been lost along with that marriage. And yet, amidst all that despair, something inside me began to awaken. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a spark of hope that this wouldn't be my final story. I didn't yet know how or when, but something inside me told me that this suffering could transform into something greater, something I would one day understand. It was in that moment of utter fragility that I realized that true strength lay not in pretending nothing had happened, but in allowing myself to feel, in accepting that I was broken and that I needed help to get back up. This awareness changed everything within me, albeit slowly and silently, and prepared me for decisions that would completely transform the journey that lay ahead. When morning came, my eyes still swollen and the feeling of emptiness consuming me, I realized I couldn't go on like this. It was as if I'd hit rock bottom, and precisely because I was there, I understood there was only one possible path: up. It was strange because, amidst so much despair, something inside me seemed to insistently remind me that I still had value, that my life didn't end with that betrayal, that my identity wasn't tied to someone else's mistake. I took a deep breath, looked in the mirror, and even though I was in excruciating pain, quietly said, "I need to start over." It was at that moment that a key turned inside me. I understood that I could no longer live as a spectator of my own story, waiting for others to decide for me, for circumstances to change, or for the pain to miraculously disappear. Life was forcing me to make decisions, and that day I chose to fight, not for my marriage, which was already broken, but for myself, for the woman I had left behind over the years. I began, still with hesitant steps, to seek God in a different way. Before, my prayers were always for others, for the problems of everyone around me, but almost never for myself. Now, my conversations with him were deep, sincere, and without masks. I cried, questioned, confessed my fears, and asked for guidance. And it was in this process that I realized that true transformation begins when we stop trying to control everything and simply surrender ourselves to God's care. This surrender wasn't easy. My mind still insisted on remembering the harsh words I'd heard from the community, the judgments, the unfair accusations. But little by little, I began to understand that my story didn't need to be defined by the eyes of others. What once seemed like the end began to reveal itself as a new beginning. It was as if I were opening a new page, where I would have the chance to rediscover myself and rebuild my life with greater awareness, courage, and faith. I started dedicating a few minutes a day to writing down my feelings in a notebook. I wrote everything down: fears, dreams, memories, prayers. This practice brought me clarity about what I wanted for the future and who I truly was beyond someone's wife. It was a small but powerful step because it made me realize that I still had control over my choices. I could decide how to react, how to position myself, and that was liberating. At the same time, I realized I needed to change my mindset. For years, I believed my worth lay in serving, pleasing, and sacrificing myself for others. But there, in that moment of rebuilding, I understood that self-love isn't selfishness, it's survival. If I didn't love myself, no one would. This hidden truth hit me like a shock, because I realized I'd spent my life trying to be enough for someone who, deep down, was never truly committed to me. I started doing little things for myself, walking outdoors, taking care of my body, learning something new, reconnecting with friendships I'd forgotten about. Every gesture, no matter how small, had a huge impact on my healing journey. And the stronger I became, the more I understood that suffering wasn't my final sentence. On the contrary, it was fueling a profound transformation, leading me to discover strengths I didn't even know I had. It was during this period that I learned about the stories of other women who had also experienced betrayal, abandonment, and cruel judgments. This showed me that I was not alone. There were behind-the-scenes stories of many lives filled with pain and resilience, but also with courageous decisions. These stories inspired me to believe that I too could be an example for someone, that my experience, however painful, could generate hope in others. And the more I sought God, the more I felt that He didn't want me to remain trapped in the past. I understood that forgiving didn't mean accepting the situation again, but rather freeing myself from a burden I no longer needed to carry. Forgiving was a decision of courage, not weakness. This revelation changed everything, because I finally realized that I no longer needed to live hostage to pain. It was a long process, full of ups and downs. There were days when I wanted to give up on everything, when loneliness seemed greater than hope. But even so, I kept taking small steps, trusting that each movement brought me closer to a new version of myself. And as I moved forward, something inside me grew stronger, the certainty that I was capable of writing a new story, much truer and more aligned with who God created me to be. The most beautiful thing was realizing that when I changed my mindset and my decisions, things around me began to change too. New people appeared in my life, unexpected opportunities arose, and I began to feel a peace I hadn't known in a long time. It was as if, after so much loss, God was showing me that there was still much more to live for. And so, step by step, my journey began to take on new meaning. A journey of reconstruction, self-discovery, and hope, one that continues to surprise me with profound and transformative revelations to this day. I began to realize that getting back on my feet wasn't a single act, but a series of small, daily choices. Choices that, at first, seemed almost insignificant, but that gradually began to completely transform my reality. I began to wake up every day with a firm resolve in my heart, not to allow pain to dictate the course of my life. This didn't mean ignoring the suffering, pretending nothing had happened, or trying to be strong all the time. On the contrary, it meant acknowledging my wounds, but not letting them define who I was or what I could be from then on. The Bible became my most faithful companion. I read and reread passages that had previously seemed like mere words, but now came alive and became profound truths within me. Verses about hope, renewal, and the promise of the future began to give me strength. It was as if God were telling me, day after day, I never left you, and I still have plans for you. This revelation changed my mindset because I understood that my story didn't end on that painful page. It was just one chapter, and I still had many more to write. Another important step was surrounding myself with women who encouraged me, who reminded me of my worth, and who prayed with me when I lacked the strength to pray myself. They were friends, sisters in faith, true gifts that God placed in my path. These sincere conversations, full of empathy and acceptance, were fundamental in my regaining my self-confidence. I realized that healing doesn't happen in isolation. It requires support, outstretched hands, people who lift us up when we fall. I also started investing time in things that made me feel good. I rediscovered old hobbies, started writing again, took walks outdoors, and took care of myself with love and attention. It may seem small, but each act of self-care was like a reminder that I deserved love and care, including my own. This internal transformation began to reflect externally. My posture changed, my eyes regained their shine, and sadness no longer occupied all the space within me. Over time, I realized that my journey wasn't just about overcoming betrayal. It was about finding myself again, reclaiming the woman I'd left behind while living for a marriage that had long since ceased to exist. This was one of the most impactful revelations for me, that for years I had sacrificed myself to try to sustain something that only I carried on my shoulders. And in freeing myself from this burden, I understood that God never intended for me to live imprisoned by someone else's mistake. It was through this process that my faith ceased to be just a habit and became a living force within me. I saw God at work in the smallest details, in the right words that reached me, in the unexpected encounters, in the silent answers that brought me peace when I needed it most. Each courageous step I took seemed to open new doors, as if He were confirming, "Keep going, I'm with you." And little by little, I realized something powerful. I no longer needed to define myself as the betrayed woman, the rejected wife, or the Christian judged by the church. I was more than that. I was a beloved daughter of God, capable of starting over, rebuilding, and inspiring other women with my story. This shift in identity was liberating because it showed me that my worth was never in someone else's hands. Little by little, the anger and hurt faded. This doesn't mean I forgot everything that happened, but I decided not to let the pain control me. Forgiveness, in that moment, stopped being a burden and became an act of liberation. Forgiveness wasn't about him, it was about me. It was about giving myself the chance to live without the chains of the past, to see life with new eyes, and to believe that the best was yet to come. I began sharing more of my story with other women who were experiencing similar situations. Behind the scenes of these conversations, I discovered a universe of silent pain, of hidden truths that no one had the courage to speak out loud. I saw how many of us were taught to accept crumbs in the name of a false sense of submission, and I understood that my testimony could be a tool for transformation, for opening the eyes of those who still believed there was no way out. This healing journey taught me that true strength lies not in appearing unshakable, but in having the courage to start over, even when all seems lost. Each day was a new invitation to decide, continue being a victim of circumstances, or become the protagonist of my own story. And the more I chose the latter, the more my life took a new direction. Today, when I look back, I realize that every tear, every night of despair, every unfair judgment was, in some way, part of shaping the woman I've become. Not because I deserved to suffer, but because God took it all and transformed it into something greater, something I could never have imagined. And that's exactly why I continue to tell my story, because I know the impact it can have on the lives of those experiencing what I did. Often, all we need is to hear someone say, "You are not alone, there is hope, there is a way." This certainty moves me, because I know that my journey of pain has become a journey of purpose, and it is still under construction, full of new chapters to be written. I learned that loving myself wasn't selfish, it was survival. It was the foundation for rebuilding everything that had been destroyed within me. For a long time, I believed that being a good Christian wife meant suppressing my desires, swallowing my pain, and accepting any situation as if it were God's will. But in that process of rebuilding, I realized that true love, the kind that comes from the Father, never requires our destruction to exist. It was liberating to understand that God didn't call me to live in silence, trapped in a life of suffering, but to be a light, a voice, a living witness to transformation. This awareness led me to profound decisions. I let go of the victim mentality and began to adopt the stance of someone who writes their own story. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone, nor about trying to recover what was lost, but about positioning myself in life as someone who finally knew its worth. And the further I walked this path, the more doors opened before me. It's amazing how, when we change within, everything around us begins to change too. I realized that one of the most painful hidden truths, especially within many religious environments, is that women are taught to endure emotional and spiritual abuse in the name of a false idea of submission. I myself carried this burden for years, believing that silence was synonymous with obedience and that complaining was a sign of spiritual weakness. But God showed me that He does not rejoice in anyone's oppression. He made me see that there is nothing holy in accepting what destroys us. On the contrary, there is holiness in choosing freedom, in saying no to what imprisons us, and, above all, in believing that it is still possible to start over. I also learned about forgiveness, but not in the distorted way I was so often taught. Forgiving wasn't about erasing history, nor reconciling with those who chose to hurt me. Forgiving, for me, was about breaking the chains of hurt that bound me to the past. It was about deciding that I would no longer carry that burden, that I would not allow bitterness to dictate my choices from then on. This decision brought a lightness I never imagined I would feel. It was like opening the window of a dark room and suddenly seeing light enter. Another powerful lesson was understanding the importance of the right community. I learned that not everyone has the capacity to support us in times of deep pain. Many people, even within the church, carry ready-made judgments and words that hurt more than they heal. Therefore, surrounding myself with women of genuine faith who truly understood God's heart made all the difference. These friendships became like anchors for me, reminding me, day after day, that I was not alone and that there was a greater purpose in everything I was experiencing. With each step of this journey, I saw God strengthening me in unexpected ways. Sometimes it was a word at the right time. Other times, a message that seemed written just for me. It was through this process that I realized how present He was even in the simplest details, as if reminding me, I'm still here, holding your hand. This certainty completely changed my mindset because it gave me the courage to dream again, to believe that the future could be good, even after so much suffering. And perhaps the most powerful lesson was understanding that starting over isn't about going back to square one, but moving forward, carrying with it everything we've learned. There's no way to be the same person after so many revelations and difficult decisions. I no longer wanted to be the woman who lived to please, who was afraid to speak out, who accepted being diminished in the name of a peace that never truly existed. Today, my voice is strong because it was born from pain, but also from healing. This process showed me the behind the scenes of something bigger than I had ever imagined, that even in the most devastating situations, God is writing chapters we can't yet see. It's as if He's saying, I know what I'm doing, trust me. And it was precisely this trust that allowed me not only to move forward, but to use my story to encourage other women who are still trapped in silences they shouldn't carry. I realized that the impact of our decisions extends far beyond ourselves. When we choose to rise up, we're not just transformed within, we begin to transform the environment around us. My posture changed, and this led others around me to question patterns, beliefs, and even certain truths they'd always accepted without reflection. That's how I understood that my pain wasn't in vain. It became a seed of change, not only for me, but for many other lives. And amidst so many revelations, I discovered that loving myself was, in fact, an act of gratitude to God. He created me with purpose, with value, with dignity. And each time I chose to respect myself, I honored that truth. Today, I know that I will never again accept being silenced, diminished, or dismissed. My journey taught me that there is no true transformation without courage, and that every decision to stand up, however small, has the power to completely change the course of a life. These lessons haven't made me immune to pain. There are still days when the memory hurts, when the questions return. But now I have answers I didn't have before. I know who I am. I know who my Father is, and I know that He never failed me, not even when all seemed lost. This gives me peace to carry on, strength to start over as many times as necessary, and hope to believe that my story is still being written, full of new chapters that reflect not what I lost, but what I gained by choosing to rise. And it is precisely this certainty that drives me to this day, because I understood that when we choose to love and respect ourselves, we open up space to live everything that God has always wanted for us, not a life of fear and conformity, but a life of purpose, freedom, and real impact on the lives of those around us. If you've made it this far with me, it's because this story somehow spoke to your heart. This brings me deep joy, because every word I share here has the sincere desire to reach and strengthen those who, like me, have needed to start over. If this content resonated with you, subscribe to the channel to continue walking with me on this journey of faith, healing, and transformation. This way, you won't miss future messages, and will also help this message reach more people who need to hear that there is hope. And tell me here in the comments, so I know you were with me until the end. Right, I'm with you until the end. I'll love reading each message and knowing who is truly experiencing this exchange of learning and strength with me. Thank you for being here, for being part of this community that grows every day and shows that it's always possible to start over. In future videos, I want to continue sharing with you everything God has taught me and the revelations that can transform not only our story, but also that of so many other women who need this light